The church bells of Cedar Ridge had been silent all day, as if holding their breath for tomorrow's grand celebration. Clara Whitfield stood at her bedroom window on the second floor of the grandest house in town, watching the last of the townspeople hurry past with ribbons and flowers clutched in their arms. The whole settlement buzzed with excitement over what folks were calling the wedding of the century, the union of the banker's daughter to one of the most prosperous ranchers in the territory. But Clara felt nothing like a bride on the eve of her wedding. The ivory silk dress hanging from the wardrobe door caught the lamplight, its pearls and lace seeming to mock her with their perfection. Her mother had ordered it from San Francisco, sparing no expense for her only daughter's special day. The dress was beautiful, Clara admitted to herself, running her fingers along the delicate beadwork. It was also everything she had never wanted. "Clara, dear, you should be getting your rest." Her mother's voice drifted through the door, followed by the soft rustle of silk skirts in the hallway. "Tomorrow will be a long day, and you want to look your best for Henry." Henry Blackwood. Clara closed her eyes and tried to summon some feeling, any feeling, for the man she was to marry in 12 hours. He was handsome enough, with his carefully groomed mustache and expensive suits from back east. He owned the largest cattle ranch in 3 counties and had built a fine house with running water and gas lamps. He was everything her father had dreamed of in a son-in-law: wealthy, respectable, and eager to expand his holdings through marriage to the banker's daughter. Henry was also as cold as Winter Creek water, and about as passionate as a business ledger. "I'm fine, Mother," Clara called back, not moving from her position at the window. She heard her mother's footsteps pause, then continue down the hall toward the master bedroom, where no doubt she would spend the evening discussing final arrangements with Clara's father. The night air carried the scent of sagebrush and distant wood smoke through her open window. Somewhere out there in the darkness lay the mountains where she had spent the happiest days of her life, before her father had decided she was too old to go riding unchaperoned into the wilderness. Before he had started bringing Henry Blackwood around for Sunday dinners and business discussions that somehow always turned to Clara's future security. She reached into the bottom drawer of her dresser, pushing aside carefully folded chemises and stockings until her fingers found what they sought. The handkerchief was yellowed with age now, its once bright blue embroidered forget-me-nots faded to a soft gray. She had stitched those flowers herself 7 years ago, when she was 18 and foolish enough to believe that love might conquer the practical considerations of frontier life. Luke Dawson had given her the plain white square of cotton after she'd fallen from her horse crossing Willow Creek. He'd torn it from his own shirt to bind a cut on her palm, his calloused hands gentle as he wrapped the makeshift bandage. Later, when the wound had healed, she had embroidered the forget-me-nots around the brown stain of her blood, a romantic girl's notion of preserving a precious memory. Luke had been everything Henry was not, tall and lean from hard work, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of pine forests. He could track a deer through rock country, gentile a wild horse with nothing but patience and soft words, and make her laugh until her sides ached. He had also been poor, the youngest son of a family that scratched out a living trapping and hunting in the high country, with no prospects beyond the next season's fur prices. Her father had made his position clear the one time Luke had worked up the courage to call at the house. Samuel Whitfield hadn't even let the young man through the front door, delivering his verdict on the front porch where half the town could witness it. "My daughter will not throw her life away on a mountain man with empty pockets and wild dreams," he had declared, his voice carrying across the dusty street. "Clara has been raised to expect better than a lifetime of uncertainty and hardship." Luke had left town that same night. Clara had waited 3 months for word from him, a letter, A message passed through mutual acquaintances. Anything to tell her that what they had shared in stolen moments by the creek and during long rides through the foothills had meant something to him. But the silence stretched on, and eventually, she had accepted what everyone told her, that Luke Dawson had been a youthful folly, and it was time to put aside childish dreams and accept the responsibilities of womanhood. Now, at 25, she was considered almost too old for marriage by frontier standards. Her father had grown increasingly anxious about settling her future before she became a burden on the family. Henry Blackwood's proposal had been received like a divine blessing, the answer to Samuel Whitfield's prayers for his daughter's security. Clara pressed the faded handkerchief to her cheek, remembering the weight of Luke's hand on her waist as he had helped her down from her horse, the way his eyes had searched her face as if memorizing every detail. She had been so certain then that she would rather face any hardship with him than live in comfort without him. 7 years had taught her the price of such romantic notions, or had they? A sound from the garden below drew her attention back to the window. The Petersons' old hound was barking at something, his deep voice echoing off the houses across the street. Clara leaned forward, trying to see what had disturbed the animal. But the shadows beneath the cottonwood trees were too deep. Probably a raccoon raiding Mrs. Peterson's vegetable garden again. The church bells began to chime 11 o'clock, their bronze voices rolling across the sleeping town. In 9 hours. Those same bells would ring out in celebration as she walked down the aisle in her ivory silk dress to become Mrs. Henry Blackwood. She would smile and accept the congratulations of the townsfolk, cut the elaborate cake her mother had ordered from the territorial capital, and dance with her new husband while the fiddles played wedding tunes. And then she would begin a lifetime of pretending to be content. Clara folded the handkerchief carefully and tucked it back into the drawer beneath her wedding lingerie. Tomorrow she would be a respectable married woman with a fine house and a secure future. She would have everything a sensible woman could want, except the one thing her heart had always craved, the freedom to choose her own path. The hound dog had fallen silent, but something else caught her attention. The soft whinny of a horse from somewhere near the back of the property. That was odd. Her father's horses were all secured in the stable for the night, and the neighbors knew better than to let their animals wander onto Samuel Whitfield's perfectly maintained grounds. Clara turned from the window and began preparing for bed, braiding her long chestnut hair and changing into her nightgown. But even as she went through the familiar motions, her mind kept returning to that strange sound. Horses didn't travel alone at night, not in country where mountain lions and bears still claimed the darkness as their own, which meant someone was out there, watching and waiting in the shadows beyond her father's house. Someone who had no business being there on the night before the wedding of the century. Clara could not sleep. For 2 hours she had lain in her narrow bed, listening to the house settle around her and watching moonlight creep across her bedroom floor. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Henry Blackwood's satisfied smile and her father's approving nod, and felt the weight of that ivory silk dress pressing down on her like a burial shroud. At 1:30 in the morning, she gave up the pretense of rest and slipped from beneath her quilted coverlet. The floorboards were cool against her bare feet as she padded to the window, drawn by a restlessness she could not name. The full moon hung fat and silver above the mountains, casting long shadows across her father's carefully tended yard, and turning the distant peaks into a landscape of mystery and promise. That was when she saw him. At first, Clara thought her sleepless mind was playing tricks on her. The figure on horseback seemed to materialize from the shadows beneath the old oak tree at the property's edge, as if the moonlight itself had taken solid form. Horse and rider stood motionless for a long moment, and Clara pressed closer to the glass, her heart hammering against her ribs. The rider's face was hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat, but something about the set of his shoulders, the easy way he sat his horse, sent recognition flooding through her like creek water in spring flood. Her hand flew to her throat, fingers finding the rapid pulse there. It couldn't be. 7 years was a lifetime on the frontier. Men died or moved on or found other women to fill the empty spaces in their hearts. Men like Luke Dawson didn't come back for girls who had waited too long and settled for security over love. But as she watched, the rider straightened in his saddle and looked directly up at her window, even across the distance and shadow. She could feel the intensity of his gaze, the same piercing attention that had once made her feel as if she were the only woman in all the territories. Her breath fogged the glass as she leaned forward, one hand pressed flat against the cool pane. The rider touched the brim of his hat in a gesture so familiar it brought tears to her eyes. Then he was moving, guiding his horse around the edge of the property with the fluid grace of a man born to the saddle. Clara lost sight of him as he passed behind the stable, but she knew where he was heading, to the old gate at the back of her father's land, the one that opened onto the trail leading up into the foothills. Without thinking, Clara grabbed her wrapper from the foot of the bed and pulled it on over her nightgown. Her hands shook as she tied the sash. 7 years of rigid propriety warring with the wild hope that had suddenly bloomed in her chest. Ladies did not slip out of their homes in the middle of the night to meet mysterious riders. Proper young women did not abandon their beds on the eve of their weddings to chase shadows and memories. But Clara was tired of being proper. She was tired of being sensible and grateful and everything her father expected her to be. Tomorrow she would walk down the aisle and promise to love, honor, and obey a man who saw her as a business arrangement. Tonight, just this once, she would follow her heart wherever it led. The house creaked softly as she made her way down the back stairs, avoiding the 7th step that always groaned under any weight. Her parents' bedroom door remained closed, her father's snores rumbling through the walls with the steady rhythm of a man whose conscience was clear. Clara slipped through the kitchen and out the back door, the night air raising gooseflesh along her arms despite the warmth of the summer evening. The back garden was a maze of silver and shadow, her mother's prized roses looking like ghostly sentinels in the moonlight. Clara picked her way carefully between the flower beds, her bare feet silent on the grass. Every few steps she paused to listen, but heard nothing except the distant hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods. The old gate stood slightly ajar, its hinges protesting softly as she pushed it open. Beyond lay the trail that wound up into the hills. The same path she had ridden so many times in her youth when the world had seemed full of infinite possibility. Now it disappeared into darkness, offering no guarantees save the promise of something different from the life that awaited her with the dawn. Clara hesitated at the threshold between her father's ordered world and the wild country beyond. Once she stepped through that gate, there would be no pretending this was simply a midnight walk to calm wedding nerves. She would be deliberately seeking out a man who was not her intended husband on the night before her wedding, with nothing but a cotton wrapper to preserve her modesty. The scandal would ruin her if anyone discovered it. Her father would be humiliated, her mother devastated. Henry Blackwood would undoubtedly withdraw his proposal, and she would be marked as a fallen woman, unsuitable for respectable marriage. In a town like Cedar Ridge, such disgrace followed a person to the grave. But as Clara stood there weighing consequences, she heard the soft nicker of a horse from somewhere ahead on the trail. The sound was answered by a low whistle, barely audible but unmistakably human. Someone was waiting for her in the darkness. someone who had risked everything to be here on this particular night. Clara stepped through the gate. The trail was rough beneath her feet, stones and twigs catching at her nightgown as she made her way up the gentle slope. The moon provided enough light to keep her from stumbling, but she had to move slowly, feeling her way around larger rocks and fallen branches. Behind her, the lights of Cedar Ridge grew smaller and more distant. The sleeping town spread out like a child's toy village in the valley below. She found him in the small clearing where Willow Creek made a bend around a stand of aspens. His horse was drinking from the stream, reins trailing loose in the mountain fashion, while the rider himself stood with his back to the trail. He had removed his hat, and moonlight caught the gold highlights in hair that was darker than she remembered, weathered by sun and wind and the passage of years. Luke? The name escaped her lips as a whisper, carrying all the uncertainty and hope of 7 lonely years. He turned slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter the moment like morning frost. In the silver light, his face was leaner than it had been, marked by lines that spoke of hard living and harder choices. But his eyes were the same deep green that had haunted her dreams. And when he smiled, Clara felt 18 again. "Hello, Clara." His voice was rougher than she remembered, worn smooth by years of calling across vast distances and speaking to horses more often than people. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I wasn't sure either." She took a step closer, then stopped. Suddenly aware of how she must look, barefoot and disheveled, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, wearing nothing but a nightgown and wrapper like some scandalous heroine from a dime novel. "You shouldn't be here. Tomorrow is my wedding day." "I know." Luke's expression grew serious, the smile fading from his eyes. "That's why I'm here. Last chance to ask you something I should have asked 7 years ago." "What's that? Do you love him?" The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Clara opened her mouth to give the expected answer, that Henry was a good man who would provide well for her, that love was a luxury frontier women could ill afford, that she was grateful for his proposal and looked forward to their life together. Instead, she found herself saying, "No, I don't love him. I don't even like him very much." Luke nodded as if he had expected nothing else. "Then come with me." "What?" Clara's heart lurched against her rib. "Come with me," he repeated, closing the distance between them with 3 quick strides. "Right now, tonight, we can be in Colorado territory by sunrise, and from there—" He gestured toward the mountains that rose like sleeping giants beyond the creek. "From there, we can go anywhere. Build a life somewhere nobody knows about banks or arranged marriages or what's proper for a woman to want." Clara stared up at him, her mind reeling. "You're asking me to run away? On the night before my wedding? I'm asking you to choose." Luke's hands found hers, his calloused fingers intertwining with her softer ones. "7 years ago, your father made the choice for both of us. Tonight, you can make it for yourself. Do you want to spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been? Or do you want to find out?" Behind them, Luke's horse lifted its head from the stream and whickered softly, as if sensing the tension in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the wild sound echoing off the canyon walls. Clara thought of her ivory silk dress hanging in the wardrobe, of the wedding cake waiting in the church basement, of the 100 guests who would gather in a few hours to witness her transformation from Samuel Whitfield's daughter to Henry Blackwood's wife. Then she thought of the faded handkerchief hidden in her dresser drawer, and the dream she had buried beneath 7 years of being sensible and grateful and good. "If we do this," she whispered, "there's no going back." "No," Luke agreed. "There isn't." But Clara... He lifted one hand to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. There's no going back from tomorrow either. Once you marry Henry Blackwood, you'll be his wife forever. Is that really what you want? Clara closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, feeling 7 years of loneliness and resignation crack open like an eggshell. When she opened them again, her decision was written in the moonlight between them. How long do I have to pack? Luke's answering smile was brighter than the moon above. Clara moved through her father's house like a ghost returning to haunt familiar rooms. Every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet sounded loud as gunshots in the sleeping silence, and twice she froze on the stairs, certain her parents would wake and discover her midnight escape. But the house remained quiet, wrapped in the peaceful dreams of those who slept with clear consciences and settled futures. In her bedroom, Clara pulled on her riding dress with trembling fingers, the practical brown wool she hadn't worn since her father had declared her too old for unescorted adventures. The fabric felt strange against her skin after years of silk and satin. But it was sturdy and warm, designed for long hours in the saddle rather than drawing room conversations. She braided her hair tightly and pinned it beneath a simple bonnet, then gathered what few belongings she could carry. A small leather satchel with her mother's silver locket, the faded handkerchief, and what little money she had saved from household allowances over the years. The ivory wedding dress watched her from its place by the wardrobe, accusatory in its perfection. Clara touched the delicate pearls one last time, then turned away. Tomorrow, her mother would find it unworn, and the truth would crash down on the Whitfield household like a mountain avalanche. She was stealing out the back door when Luke appeared from the shadows near the stable, leading a second horse, a gentle-looking mare with kind eyes and a side saddle that had seen better days but would serve its purpose. I borrowed her from the Methodist minister, Luke whispered, helping Clara into the saddle. Reverend Morrison won't mind, and she's steady as stone. Can you ride astride if we need to move fast? Clara nodded, memories flooding back of childhood races through the foothills when she had ridden like a wild thing, her skirts hiked up scandalously and her hair streaming behind her. I remember. Luke's hand lingered on her knee for a moment, his touch warm through the wool of her dress. Once we leave your father's property, there's no turning back. Are you certain this is what you want? In answer, Clara urged the mare forward, away from the house where she had spent 25 years learning to be proper and obedient and grateful for whatever scraps of happiness others chose to give her. Luke swung into his own saddle with fluid grace, and together they rode into the darkness beyond Cedar Ridge. The first hour passed in tense silence as they picked their way along familiar trails, Luke leading them through country he knew as well as the lines of his own hands. They rode single file through narrow passages between towering rocks, where the sound of their horses' hooves was muffled by sand and fallen leaves. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs with every step, expecting at any moment to hear her father's voice calling her name, or the thunder of pursuing horses carrying Henry Blackwood and half the men in town. But the night remained quiet except for the rustle of wind through pine boughs and the distant cry of a mountain cat claiming its territory. Gradually, Clara felt the rigid fear in her shoulders begin to ease as Cedar Ridge fell further behind them. With each mile, the invisible chains that had bound her to duty and expectation grew looser, until she could almost believe she was truly free. They paused to rest the horses at a small stream where moonlight turned the water to liquid silver. Luke dismounted and cupped his hands to drink, then filled his canteen and offered it to Clara. The water was cold and sweet, tasting of mountain snow and freedom. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, finally breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving town. Luke settled beside her on a fallen log, close enough that she could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. North, through the high passes. I know places where we can rest. People who won't ask questions, but Clara. He turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the pale light. It won't be easy. The mountains are hard country, especially for someone who's lived soft. I'm stronger than I look, Clara said, lifting her chin with a defiance that surprised them both. Luke smiled at that, the first genuine warmth she had seen from him since their reunion. I know you are. I remember a girl who could ride all day and never complain, who helped birth a foal with hands steadier than the veterinarians. That girl is still in there somewhere, isn't she? I hope so, Clara whispered. I've been pretending to be someone else for so long. I'm not sure I remember who I really am. You're the woman who chose freedom over security, Luke said quietly. The woman who walked away from everything safe and comfortable because she wanted something real. That's who you are, Clara. That's who you've always been. They rode on as the moon began its descent toward the western peaks, following game trails and creek beds that would hide their tracks from anyone foolish enough to follow. Luke knew this country like a map written in his bones, guiding them through passages Clara would never have found on her own. Sometimes they rode side by side when the terrain allowed, and he told her about the years since he had left Cedar Ridge. He had gone north to Montana Territory first, working cattle drives and learning the hard lessons of frontier survival. Later, he had tried his hand at mining in Colorado, spending back-breaking months in tunnels that yielded more rock than gold. For the past 2 years, he had been running horses between settlements scattered across the high country, building a reputation as a man who could gentle the wildest Mustang and deliver his promises on time. I never forgot you, he said as they paused at the crest of a ridge overlooking a valley Clara had never seen before. 7 years. And I never stopped thinking about the girl who embroidered forget-me-nots on a torn piece of my shirt. I kept it, Clara admitted. All these years, hidden away like some shameful secret. Mother would have thrown it out if she'd found it. Your mother never understood you, Luke observed. Neither did your father. They wanted to keep you safe in a cage made of silk and good intentions, never realizing that safety isn't worth much if it costs you your soul. The truth of those words settled over Clara like a well-worn shawl. She had been dying slowly in that cage, smothering under the weight of expectations that had nothing to do with who she truly was. Tonight, for the first time in 7 years, she felt fully alive. As dawn approached, they found shelter in a small cave Luke remembered from his hunting days, hidden behind a curtain of wild grapevines and accessible only to those who knew where to look. The horses were tired, and both riders needed rest before continuing their journey into the unknown. Luke unsaddled the animals and rubbed them down with handfuls of dry grass while Clara gathered deadwood for a small fire. The domestic routine felt strange and wonderful after years of having every task performed by servants and every decision made by others. Her hands remembered the skills her father had considered inappropriate for a lady. How to build a fire that wouldn't smoke, how to find the driest wood, how to read the sky for signs of changing weather. Are you hungry? Luke asked, producing a small bag of supplies from his saddlebags. I've got hardtack and jerky, and there are berries growing near the stream if you don't mind getting your hands dirty. Clara laughed, surprising herself with the sound. When was the last time you saw me worry about getting my hands dirty? They shared a simple meal as the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Through the cave opening, Clara could see the valley spreading below them like a green carpet dotted with wildflowers. Pristine and untouched by the ambitions of men like her father and Henry Blackwood. somewhere far below. Cedar Ridge was waking to the scandal of her disappearance, but here in this hidden place, she felt as if she had stepped outside the world entirely. "Do you regret it?" Luke asked quietly. "Leaving everything behind?" Clara considered the question seriously, thinking of her mother's inevitable tears and her father's rage, of the wedding guests who would gather in vain and the elaborate cake that would go uneaten. She thought of the ivory dress hanging empty in her wardrobe and the life of comfortable servitude she had abandoned. "No," she said finally, and meant it. "I regret waiting so long to choose for myself." Luke reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the easy intimacy of long-ago lovers reunited. "Then we'll make our own life, Clara. Somewhere clean and new, where nobody knows about banks or cattle ranches or what's proper for a woman to want. Just you and me and whatever we can build together." "It won't be easy," Clara said, echoing his earlier warning. "No," Luke agreed, "but it will be ours." As the sun climbed higher and the cave filled with golden light, Clara felt the last of her old life slip away like a shed skin. She was no longer Samuel Whitfield's obedient daughter or Henry Blackwood's intended bride. She was simply Clara, riding toward an uncertain future with the man she had never stopped loving, carrying nothing but hope and the courage to claim her own destiny. Behind them, the respectable world continued its orderly existence, but Clara no longer belonged to it. She belonged to the mountains and the sky and the endless possibility of the trail ahead. For the first time in 7 years, that was enough. For 3 days, Clara lived as she had never imagined possible. They traveled deeper into the wilderness, following ancient deer paths and hidden valleys that existed far from the reach of civilization's rules and expectations. Each morning brought new wonders: crystal-clear lakes reflecting snow-capped peaks, meadows carpeted with wildflowers that had no names in any drawing-room conversation, and vast skies that seemed to stretch into eternity. Luke proved to be a patient teacher, guiding Clara back to skills she had forgotten during her years of enforced refinement. The first morning, when she struggled to build a fire with hands soft from years of needlework and piano lessons, he knelt beside her without a word of criticism. "Remember," he said quietly, arranging the kindling with careful precision, "the secret is in the breathing. Feed it air, but not too much. Like tending anything precious, it needs room to grow, but also protection." Clara watched his weathered hands work, noting how he built a small nest of the finest tinder before adding larger pieces, creating spaces for air to flow. When the tiny flame caught and began to spread, she felt a surge of pride, as if she had accomplished something far greater than any embroidery sampler or perfectly executed waltz. "I remember now," she whispered, and Luke smiled at the wonder in her voice. By the second day, her hands had begun to remember their old confidence. She helped Luke set snares for rabbits and gather wild greens that would supplement their dwindling supplies. Her riding skirt grew dusty and torn. Her hair escaped its pins to hang in loose tendrils around her face, and her skin took on a golden glow from hours under the mountain sun. She had never felt more beautiful. They made camp each evening by streams and springs, places where the horses could drink and graze, while Clara and Luke shared simple meals around their small fire. The food was plain: roasted rabbit, wild onions, and berries gathered from thorny bushes, but it tasted better than any elaborate dinner she had ever consumed in her father's dining room. On the third evening, as they sheltered in a grove of aspens beside a singing creek, Luke produced a harmonica from his saddlebags. The melody he played was sweet and melancholy, a song Clara had never heard but that seemed to capture everything she felt about these precious days of freedom. My brother taught me that tune, Luke said when the last notes faded into the twilight. Before the fever took him in '68. He used to say music was the only thing a man could carry anywhere. The only treasure that got lighter the more you shared it. Clara settled closer to him on the fallen log they used as a bench, her shoulder touching his. Play it again. As the harmonica's voice rose once more into the evening air, Clara found herself humming along, her voice weaving through the melody like water through stones. She had been trained in proper parlor songs with moral lessons and refined sentiments. But this simple tune spoke to something deeper in her soul. When the song ended, Luke set the harmonica aside and turned to face her fully. In the firelight, his eyes held depth she was still learning to navigate. "Clara," he said softly, "are you sure about this? Once word reaches the territorial authorities, they'll be looking for us. Your father has influence, and Henry Blackwood has money. We'll be labeled as fugitives. Maybe worse." "What would you call us?" Clara asked. Luke considered this carefully. "Free," he said finally. "I'd call us free." That night, they lay side by side under a canopy of stars more brilliant than any chandelier, wrapped in separate blankets but sharing the warmth of the dying fire. Clara had never slept outdoors before, had never realized how alive the darkness could be with the sounds of night creatures going about their mysterious business. An owl called from the ridge above them, answered by its mate from across the valley. Somewhere in the distance, coyotes sang their wild songs to the moon. "Luke," Clara's voice was soft in the darkness, "do you ever regret not fighting for me 7 years ago?" She heard him shift beside her, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of long reflection. "Every day. I told myself I was being noble, accepting your father's judgment that I wasn't good enough for you. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of being humiliated, afraid of proving him right. I thought if I could make something of myself, earn enough money to be respectable, then maybe. But you came back anyway. I came back because I finally realized that waiting for permission to live your life is just another way of dying. Your father was never going to consider me worthy, no matter what I accomplished. The only opinion that mattered was yours, and I'd been too much of a coward to ask for it." Clara turned onto her side, facing him in the darkness. She could just make out the outline of his profile against the starlit sky. "You're asking now?" "I'm asking now," he agreed. "Then here's my answer." Clara reached across the space between them, her fingers finding his face in the darkness. "I choose you, Luke Dawson. Not because you're safe or respectable or what anyone else thinks I should want. I choose you because when I'm with you, I remember who I was meant to be." Their first kiss in 7 years was tentative, tasting of mountain air and possibility. When they separated, Clara felt as if something fundamental had shifted in the world around them, as if the stars themselves had rearranged to mark this moment of choosing. The 4th day brought them to a hidden valley Luke had discovered during his wandering years, a place so remote and beautiful it seemed to exist outside the ordinary world. A waterfall tumbled down the far wall of rock, feeding a pool so clear Clara could see trout moving in its depths. Wild roses climbed the canyon walls, filling the air with their sweet perfume, and meadowlarks called from the tall grass. "I used to dream about bringing you here," Luke confessed as they made camp beside the pool. "All those nights on the trail, sleeping under cold stars. I'd imagined showing you this place." Clara explored every corner of their temporary paradise while Luke tended the horses. She discovered patches of wild strawberries, their fruit tiny but intensely sweet, and a grove of serviceberry bushes heavy with purple fruit. Near the waterfall, she found a collection of smooth stones worn into perfect circles by centuries of flowing water. That evening, she presented Luke with the 3 most perfect stones, each one small enough to fit in the palm of his hand. "What are these for?" he asked, turning them over in his fingers. "Promises," Clara said solemnly. "One for the past we're leaving behind, one for the present we're choosing, and one for the future we're going to build together." Luke's smile was soft in the firelight. "And what do we do with them?" "We throw them in the pool and make our promises to the water. My grandmother used to say that promises made to moving water always come true, because the water carries them to every corner of the world." It was a child's game, something Clara's Cherokee grandmother had taught her before propriety had forbidden such heathen nonsense. But here in this hidden valley, with the stars reflecting in the dark water and the waterfall singing its ancient song, it felt like the most sacred ceremony imaginable. Luke went first, holding the smallest stone in his palm. "For the past," he said clearly, "I promise to let go of the fear that kept me from fighting for what I wanted. I won't let anyone else's judgment decide my worth." The stone disappeared into the pool with a soft splash, sending ripples across the reflected stars. Clara took the second stone. "For the present," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her throat. "I promise to stop apologizing for who I am. I won't make myself smaller to fit into someone else's idea of what a lady should be." Her stone joined Luke's in the depths of the pool. Together, they held the third stone, their hands touching around its smooth surface. "For the future," Luke began, "we promise to build something honest," Clara continued, "something that belongs to us alone, something worth the risk we're taking." They released the stone together, watching it sink into the dark water beside its companions. Later, as they sat beside the dying fire with Luke's arm around her shoulders, Clara felt a peace she had never known before. Tomorrow they would have to leave this valley and return to the harsh realities of a world that would not approve of their choices. There would be challenges ahead, dangers she could not yet imagine, and hardships that would test everything they believed about love and freedom. But tonight, under the vast mountain sky, she was exactly where she belonged. For the first time in her life, she was living a story of her own making, one written in starlight and sealed with promises thrown into moving water. "No matter what happens," she whispered against Luke's shoulder, "I'll never regret these days." "Nor will I," he replied, his lips brushing her hair. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Above them, the waterfall continued its eternal song, carrying their promises down the mountain toward whatever future awaited two people brave enough to choose love over security, freedom over convention, and each other over the entire disapproving world. The first sign of trouble came on the 5th morning, when Luke returned from checking their back trail with a grim expression that made Clara's stomach clench with sudden fear. "We're being followed," he said quietly, extinguishing their small breakfast fire with methodical care. "3 riders, maybe 4. They've been keeping their distance, but they're tracking us sure enough." Clara's hands stilled on the camp pot she had been cleaning. "How can you tell?" "Broken branches that weren't broken yesterday, horse droppings too fresh to be from wild animals, and smoke on the wind that doesn't belong to any settlement I know of." Luke was already moving, gathering their scattered belongings with efficient haste. "We need to ride hard today, put some distance between us and whoever's back there." They broke camp in tense silence, both knowing without speaking that their precious days of freedom were coming to an end. As they rode out of the hidden valley, Clara looked back once at the waterfall where they had made their promises, wondering if she would ever see such peace again. The day's travel was punishing, taking them through country that grew progressively more difficult as Luke sought routes that would slow their pursuers. They threaded through narrow canyons where the walls seemed to press in from both sides, crossed streams at rocky fords that would hide their tracks, and climbed steep slopes that left the horses blowing hard in the thin mountain air. By afternoon, Clara's riding dress was soaked with perspiration, and her hands had blistered from gripping the reins. But she didn't complain, reading the urgency in Luke's posture as he constantly scanned the terrain around them. Whatever was following them was serious enough to drive him to push both horses and riders to their limits. They stopped briefly at midday to rest the animals and share what little food remained in their saddlebags. Clara noticed that Luke barely touched his portion, his attention focused on the country behind them. "Who do you think it is?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Luke's jaw tightened. "Could be a territorial marshal. If your father convinced the authorities you were taken against your will. Could be bounty hunters, if Henry posted a reward. Or it could be something worse." "Worse? Men who don't care about bringing you back alive, only about collecting whatever price has been put on my head." The thought sent ice through Clara's veins. She had been so focused on her own rebellion against propriety and expectation that she hadn't fully considered the danger her choice might bring to Luke. In the eyes of the law, he had stolen another man's bride, committed what many would consider an unforgivable crime against both family honor and social order. They rode on through the afternoon, the horses' pace growing increasingly labored as the terrain grew rougher. Luke led them along game trails that barely deserved the name, through stands of timber so thick they had to dismount and lead the animals through passages barely wide enough for horse and rider. As evening approached, they crested a ridge and saw below them a sight that made Clara's heart lift with desperate hope. A small homestead nestled in a green valley, with smoke rising from the chimney and washing hanging on a line behind the cabin. The domestic scene looked like salvation after hours of empty wilderness. "Thank God," Clara breathed. "We can ask for help, maybe get directions to the nearest town." But Luke's expression remained troubled. "Maybe. Or maybe we're walking into more trouble than we're leaving behind." They approached the cabin cautiously, Luke's hand resting on the pistol at his hip. A woman emerged from the house as they drew near, middle-aged and sturdy, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent eyes that took in every detail of their appearance. "Good evening," Luke called out, touching his hat brim respectfully. "We're travelers heading north, wondering if we might water our horses and perhaps trade for some supplies." The woman's gaze lingered on Clara's torn and dusty riding dress, taking note of the obvious quality of the fabric beneath the trailwear. "Come down off those horses and welcome," she said finally. "I'm Martha Henley. My husband's out checking the cattle, but he'll be back before full dark." Clara dismounted gratefully, her legs shaking with exhaustion. Martha Henley's sharp eyes missed nothing, not the expensive cut of Clara's dress, nor the way Luke positioned himself protectively between her and any potential threat. "You folks look like you've been riding hard," Martha observed, leading them toward the well where the horses could drink. "Long way between settlements in this country." "Yes, ma'am," Luke agreed carefully. "We're hoping to reach Colorado territory before winter sets in." Martha's eyes narrowed slightly. "Colorado's a long way off. Most folks heading that direction take the main roads through the settlements, not the high country trails." She paused, studying Clara's face in the fading light. "You wouldn't happen to be running from something, would you?" The question hung in the evening air like smoke from a distant fire. Clara felt Luke tense beside her, his hand moving almost imperceptibly toward his weapon. But before either of them could respond, Martha's expression shifted to one of recognition. "Lord Almighty," she whispered, staring at Clara with widening eyes. "You're her, aren't you? The banker's daughter from Cedar Ridge. I saw you once at the territorial fair 3 years back, wearing a blue dress with white lace. You're the girl who ran off on her wedding day." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. If Martha Henley recognized her, it meant word of her disappearance had already spread far beyond Cedar Ridge. The implications of that realization crashed over her like cold water. "I don't know what you mean," Clara began, but Martha cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Don't waste breath lying to me, child. I may live in the middle of nowhere, but news travels. 3 days ago, a man came through here asking questions about strangers on the roads. Well-dressed fellow with a badge and mean eyes, offering a hefty reward for information about a kidnapped bride and the outlaw who took her." Luke stepped forward, his voice deadly quiet. "What did you tell him?" Martha studied them both for a long moment, her weathered face unreadable. Finally, she smiled, the expression that transformed her stern features into something almost motherly. "I told him I hadn't seen hide nor hair of anybody matching that description," she said firmly. "And I told him the same thing I'm going to tell anybody else who comes asking, that Martha Henley minds her own business and expects others to do the same." Relief flooded through Clara so powerfully she nearly staggered. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," Martha replied, her expression growing serious again. "That man who was here, he called himself Deputy Marshal Kane, and he had the look of someone who doesn't give up easy. Said he was heading into the high country with a tracking party, following leads about your whereabouts." Luke cursed softly under his breath. "Elias Kane. I should have known they'd send him." "You know this marshal?" Clara asked. "Not a marshal," Luke replied grimly. "Kane's a bounty hunter who sometimes carries a badge when it suits his purposes. He's got a reputation for bringing in his quarry one way or another, and he's not particular about which way that turns out to be." Martha nodded knowingly. "That's the impression I got. Man had cruel hands and eyes like winter ice, the kind who'd shoot first and ask questions later, if you take my meaning." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation, and Martha's husband appeared around the corner of the cabin, a lean, sun-weathered man with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime working the land. "Evening, folks," he said, dismounting from a tired-looking horse. "I'm Joseph Henley. Martha been taking good care of you?" "Better than we deserve," Luke replied, and Clara heard the genuine gratitude in his voice. "Over a simple supper of cornbread, beans, and fresh milk." The Henleys shared what they knew about the search that was closing in around them. The story that had reached their remote homestead painted Clara as an innocent victim, and Luke as a desperate criminal who had used force to steal her away from her lawful husband-to-be. "Course, that's not how it looks to me," Martha said matter-of-factly, refilling Clara's cup with coffee that was stronger than anything she had ever tasted. "Girl who's been kidnapped doesn't sit a horse like she was born to it, doesn't have hands that know their way around camp chores, and doesn't look at her supposed captor like he hung the moon." Joseph nodded agreement. "Man takes a woman against her will, doesn't treat her gentle-like, doesn't make sure she's got the warm spot by the fire." "But the law won't see it that way," Luke said heavily. "Far as they're concerned, Clara's father has the right to choose her husband, and I'm the villain who interfered with that right. Laws made by men who never had to live under them," Martha observed tartly. But you're right about one thing. Kane and his men won't be interested in hearing your side of the story. Joseph leaned back in his chair, studying them both in the lamplight. You folks have anywhere particular you're headed? Luke and Clara exchanged glances. They had been living day by day, focused only on staying ahead of pursuit and finding brief moments of happiness in their stolen freedom. The question of where they were ultimately going, what their future might hold, was one they had been afraid to discuss. There's a settlement in northern Colorado, Luke said finally. Place called Haven Creek, way up in the mountains where folks don't ask too many questions about a person's past. I've got a friend there who might be willing to help us get started. Haven Creek's a hard place to reach, Joseph warned. Especially with winter coming on. You'd have to cross the Devil's Backbone Pass, and that's treacherous country even in good weather. More treacherous than staying here with Kane on our trail? Clara asked quietly. Joseph considered this. Fair point, but you'll need supplies for that journey, and good horses that can handle the altitude. What you're riding now won't make it halfway. Martha stood and began clearing the dishes, her movements brisk with decision. Then we'd best get you properly outfitted. Joseph, go out to the barn and pick out 2 of our best mountain horses. Strong ones that know their footing. Martha, Joseph began, we can't just what? Help 2 young people who've got the courage to choose their own path in life? Martha's voice carried the authority of a woman accustomed to having her way. I was 19 when I ran off with you. Joseph Henley, against my father's wishes and the disapproval of half the county. Who are we to judge these 2 for doing the same thing? Clara felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected kindness from strangers. We can pay you, she said, thinking of the small amount of money in her satchel. Keep your money, Martha said firmly. You'll need every penny where you're going. Just promise me something. Anything, Clara replied. Promise me you'll build something good together. Something worth all this trouble and heartache. Don't waste the gift you're giving each other. Outside, the evening wind carried the distant sound of hoofbeats from the direction they had come. All 4 of them froze, listening to the rhythmic drumming that seemed to grow louder with each passing moment. How many? Luke asked quietly. Joseph moved to the window and peered out into the gathering darkness. 4, maybe 5 riders, moving fast and purposeful. Luke was already reaching for his gun belt. Kane found our trail. Not necessarily, Martha said calmly, though Clara could see the tension in her shoulders. Could be anybody passing through. But best we don't take chances. She turned to Clara and Luke with the efficient manner of someone who had faced danger before. There's a root cellar behind the house, hidden under a trap door. You can wait there until they pass. We won't put you in danger, Luke protested. Too late for that, Joseph said grimly, checking the loads in his rifle. They're already here. The root cellar smelled of earth and stored potatoes, its darkness broken only by thin slivers of light that crept through the rough wooden boards above. Clara pressed herself against the dirt wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would betray their hiding place. Beside her, Luke crouched like a coiled spring, his hand resting on his pistol grip. Above them, boots stomped across the cabin's wooden floor with the heavy authority of men accustomed to getting their way. Clara could hear Martha's voice, steady and unimpressed, answering questions with the careful politeness of someone who had dealt with unwelcome visitors before. Evening, gentlemen. Rather late to be calling, isn't it? A rough voice responded, carrying the kind of casual menace that made Clara's skin crawl. Ma'am, I'm Deputy Marshal Kane, and these are my associates. We're tracking 2 dangerous fugitives who may have passed through this area. A kidnapped woman and the outlaw who took her. Kidnapped, you say? Martha's tone remained perfectly neutral. How terrible for the poor girl's family. Indeed. The woman's father is beside himself with worry, and her intended husband has posted a substantial reward for her safe return. Kane's voice grew harder. We have reason to believe the criminals are traveling through this territory, possibly seeking aid from locals who might be sympathetic to their cause. Clara could practically hear the implied threat in those words. Luke's jaw tightened beside her, and she placed a restraining hand on his arm, feeling the tension coiled there like a loaded spring. Well, I certainly haven't seen any kidnappers, Martha replied calmly. My husband and I live quietly here, mind our own business. Don't get many visitors except for the occasional traveler looking to water their horses. Travelers, you say? Another voice joined the conversation, smoother, more cultured, but somehow more frightening than Kane's obvious brutality. Clara recognized it immediately and felt ice form in her stomach. Henry Blackwood had come personally to retrieve his wayward bride. Yes, sir, Martha continued, apparently unfazed by the growing crowd in her small cabin. Folks heading to the settlements mostly. Sometimes prospectors going up into the high country. Mrs. Henley. Henry's voice carried the patient tone he might use with a difficult child. I believe you may not fully understand the gravity of this situation. The woman we're seeking is my betrothed bride, stolen from our wedding day by a desperate criminal. She's undoubtedly frightened and confused, possibly even injured. Any assistance you might provide would be generously rewarded. Clara bit her lip to keep from making a sound. Henry spoke as if she were a lost pet rather than a person capable of making her own decisions. The familiar condescension in his voice reminded her of everything she had been trying to escape. That does sound distressing, Martha agreed smoothly. What does this poor girl look like, in case I should happen to see her? About 25 years old, chestnut hair, well-bred features. She would have been wearing a fine riding dress, though it may be worse for wear by now. Henry's voice took on a proprietary note that made Clara's skin crawl. She's a delicate creature, unused to hardship. I fear what prolonged exposure to the wilderness might do to her constitution. Above them, Clara heard the scrape of chair legs and Joseph's measured voice joining the conversation. Sounds like quite a search you've got going. Must be important to bring you all the way out here to the middle of nowhere. The girl's father spared no expense, Kane replied. Samuel Whitfield is a man of considerable influence in the territory. He wants his daughter returned safely, and he wants the man who took her to face justice. Luke's hand found Clara's in the darkness, his fingers intertwining with hers. She could feel the anger radiating from him like heat from a forge, and she squeezed his hand in warning. Whatever happened, they couldn't afford to let emotion override caution. Justice, Martha repeated thoughtfully. And what sort of justice would that be exactly? The territorial court will handle the legal proceedings, Henry said smoothly, though I understand there's considerable sentiment for more immediate resolution of the matter. Meaning. Joseph's voice had gone carefully flat. Kane's laugh held no humor. Meaning horse thieves and kidnappers don't always make it to trial in this territory. Sometimes justice gets served right where the crime was committed. Clara felt sick. They weren't just hunting her and Luke. They were planning murder, dressed up in the respectable language of law and order. Her father's influence and Henry's money had turned them into prey for men who would kill first and justify it later. I see, Martha said after a long pause. Well, as I said, we haven't seen anyone matching that description. But if we should happen to encounter these fugitives, What would you have us do? Send word immediately to the Territorial Marshal's office in Silver Creek. Kane replied. Don't attempt to detain them yourselves. The man is armed and dangerous. Just get word to the authorities and stay clear. We'll certainly keep that in mind, Joseph said diplomatically. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Kane asking detailed questions about nearby trails and settlements, while Henry occasionally interjected with reminders of the substantial reward waiting for information. Clara could tell that the Henleys were walking a careful line, providing just enough cooperation to avoid suspicion while revealing nothing useful. Finally, she heard the scrape of boots heading toward the door. We'll be making camp about a mile south of here, Kane announced. If you remember anything at all, you know where to find us. Of course, Martha replied. I do hope you find that poor girl soon. Her family must be worried sick. Indeed they are, Henry said, and Clara could hear the false concern in his voice. Clara was always such a dutiful daughter. This behavior is completely unlike her. I'm convinced she's been coerced, possibly even threatened into compliance. The boots moved across the porch and down the steps, followed by the jingle of harness and the sound of horses being mounted. Clara held her breath until the hoofbeats faded into the distance, then sagged against the earthen wall in relief. Above them, the trapdoor opened with a soft creak, and Martha's face appeared in the opening. They're gone, she said quietly. But they've made camp close by. This Kane fellow isn't the type to give up easy. Luke helped Clara climb out of the cellar, her legs shaky from crouching in the cramped space. Joseph was standing by the window, his rifle still in his hands. They'll be watching the main trails, Joseph said grimly, and they've got enough men to cover a lot of ground. Did you hear what they said? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They're not planning to take us back for trial. Kane means to kill Luke and probably claim I died trying to defend my captor. Martha's face hardened. I heard that fancy man talking about you like you were a prize heifer that wandered off from the herd. That's Henry Blackwood, Clara said bitterly. My intended husband, the man my father chose to secure my future. Some future, Martha snorted. Man talks about you like you don't have sense enough to make your own decisions. That's because he doesn't believe I do, Clara replied. In his world, women are property to be managed, not people with minds of their own. Luke had been silent during this exchange, but now he spoke up, his voice rough with suppressed anger. There's something else. Did you notice what Kane said about my being a horse thief? You haven't stolen any horses, Clara protested. No, but I borrowed that mare from Reverend Morrison without asking permission. If they're calling that theft, it means they're building a case that will justify whatever they plan to do to me. Joseph nodded grimly. Classic technique. Make the charges serious enough that nobody questions rough justice. What they said about my father, Clara began, then stopped, her mind reeling with implications she didn't want to examine. What about him? Luke asked gently. Kane said my father spared no expense, that he wanted me returned safely. But Henry talked about substantial rewards and territorial influence. Clara looked up at Luke with growing horror. What if my father doesn't know what they're really planning? What if Henry convinced him this was about rescue when it's really about revenge? Martha and Joseph exchanged glances. Could be, Martha said carefully. Or could be your father knows exactly what kind of men he's hired and doesn't much care how they get the job done. The possibility that her father might have sanctioned murder hit Clara like a physical blow. Samuel Whitfield was rigid and controlling, but she had never thought him capable of deliberate violence. Yet the evidence was mounting that either he was more ruthless than she had imagined, or he had been manipulated by Henry into unleashing forces he didn't understand. "There's something else troubling me," Luke said slowly. "How did they track us so easily? We were careful to hide our trail, stayed off the main routes, yet they found us faster than should have been possible." "You think someone's been feeding them information?" Joseph asked. "I think it's possible. Someone who knows this country, knows the trails and hiding places." Martha's expression grew thoughtful. "There's been talk in the settlements about a man working both sides, takes money from folks needing to disappear, then sells them out to whoever's willing to pay more." "A name?" Luke asked sharply. "Goes by Tom Fletcher, though that might not be his real name. Operates out of a trading post up near Copper Falls. Been known to guide people through the high country for a price." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Do you think he might have—" "Don't know," Luke said grimly. "But it would explain how they stayed so close to us despite our precautions." Joseph moved to the window again, peering out into the darkness. "Whatever the case, you folks can't stay here. Come morning, Kane's going to start a more thorough search of the area. He'll find signs of your presence eventually." "We know," Luke said. "We appreciate everything you've done, but we won't put you in more danger." "Danger's already here," Martha said firmly. "Question is what we do about it." She moved to a chest in the corner and began pulling out supplies, dried meat, flour, coffee, and a worn but serviceable coat. "Joseph, go saddle our two best mountain horses, the sorrel mare and the black gelding." "Martha," Clara protested, "we can't take your horses. You need them for your ranch." "Ranch will manage," Martha replied briskly. "What we can't manage is knowing we stood by and let that Kane fellow murder two young people whose only crime was choosing love over convenience." Joseph paused at the door. "There's an old mining road that leads up toward Devil's Backbone. Haven't used it in years, but it might get you past their search pattern. Problem is, it's dangerous country, especially this time of year." "More dangerous than staying here?" Luke asked. "Different kind of dangerous. The road dangerous because it's falling apart and goes through avalanche country. But the men hunting you are dangerous because they're planning murder." Clara made her decision. "We'll take the mining road." Luke looked at her sharply. "Clara, you don't understand what that means. If we get caught in bad weather up there, then we'll face bad weather together," she said firmly. "I won't let them drag me back to marry Henry Blackwood, and I won't let them kill you for giving me the chance to choose my own life." Martha smiled at that, the first genuine warmth Clara had seen from the older woman. "That's the spirit, child. Better to risk death as a free woman than live as a comfortable slave." As they prepared for their desperate flight into the high country, Clara felt a strange sense of clarity settling over her. The comfortable illusions of her old life had been stripped away, revealing the ugly truth beneath Henry's smooth words and her father's protective control. Whatever lay ahead in the mountains, it would be honest danger faced by her own choice, not the slow suffocation of a life lived according to other people's plans. She thought of the ivory wedding dress hanging empty in her wardrobe back in Cedar Ridge, and felt no regret at all. The old mining road wound through country that seemed designed to test the resolve of anyone foolish enough to traverse it. For 2 days, Clara and Luke had pushed higher into the mountains, following a path that was little more than a suggestion carved into the rock face decades ago by men desperate enough for gold to risk their lives on impossible terrain. Their borrowed horses picked their way carefully along ledges barely wide enough for a single rider, with 1,000-foot drops yawning beside them and loose shale that could send an unwary traveler tumbling into the abyss. The air grew thinner with each mile of elevation, leaving both horses and riders gasping in the crystalline atmosphere that made every breath a conscious effort. Clara's hands were raw from gripping the reins, her face wind-burned and her body aching from hours in the saddle. But she had never felt more alive. Every step forward was a step away from the suffocating world of drawing rooms and arranged marriages. Every mile gained a declaration of independence written in stone and sky. On the third morning, they crested a ridge and saw smoke rising from a valley below. Not the thin wisp of a campfire, but the thick, purposeful column that spoke of a settlement. Luke consulted the crude map Joseph Henley had sketched for them, his weathered finger tracing the route they had traveled. "Should be a place called Timber Falls," he said, squinting through the morning haze. "Used to be a logging camp, but the timber played out years ago. Might be folks still living there, might be abandoned. Either way, we need supplies," Clara replied practically. Their food was nearly gone, and the horses needed grain and rest before attempting the final push through Devil's Backbone Pass. "And I could use a bath and a hot meal." Luke smiled at that, the first genuine warmth she had seen from him since leaving the Henley homestead. "Think you can stand to be a proper lady for an hour or two?" "I think I've forgotten how," Clara said, and realized it was true. The woman who had laced herself into corsets and minded her manners through endless social obligations seemed like a stranger now, someone she had known in a previous life. The settlement of Timber Falls consisted of perhaps 20 buildings scattered along both sides of a mountain stream, most of them weathered gray by wind and weather. A few showed signs of current habitation, smoke from chimneys, glass in the windows, gardens growing behind split-rail fences. Others stood empty and forlorn, their doors hanging open like mouths frozen in permanent surprise. They rode slowly down the main street, drawing curious stares from the handful of residents who paused in their daily routines to observe the newcomers. Clara was acutely aware of how they must appear, travel-stained and exhausted, riding horses that bore no resemblance to the animals they had started with, carrying themselves with the wary alertness of people accustomed to looking over their shoulders. The largest intact building bore a hand-painted sign proclaiming it to be Murphy's General Store and Saloon, and it was there they tied their horses and stepped onto the wooden sidewalk that had seen better days. The proprietor who emerged to greet them was a barrel-chested man with graying hair and intelligent eyes that took in every detail of their appearance. "Welcome to Timber Falls," he said with genuine warmth. "I'm Patrick Murphy, and this is my establishment. You folks look like you could use some refreshment." "We're travelers heading north," Luke replied carefully, "hoping to trade for supplies before we continue on." Murphy's eyes sharpened slightly, but his smile remained welcoming. "North, you say? Mighty late in the season to be heading into the high country. Winter comes early up there, and it doesn't give much warning. We have urgent business in Colorado territory," Clara said, stepping forward. Something in Murphy's manner suggested he was a man who could be trusted, though she had learned to be cautious about such judgments. "Well then, come inside and we'll see what we can do for you." Murphy held the door open with old-world courtesy. "My wife's got stew on the stove and there's fresh bread if you're hungry." The interior of Murphy's establishment was warm and welcoming, with a pot-bellied stove radiating heat and the mingled aromas of cooking food and fresh coffee. A woman emerged from the back room, small and neat, with prematurely white hair and the kind of face that spoke of a lifetime of kindness tempered by frontier pragmatism. "This is my wife, Bridget," Murphy said by way of introduction. "Love, these folks are travelers heading north. They look like they could use some of your cooking." Bridget Murphy's sharp eyes missed nothing as she looked them over, but her smile was warm. "Sit yourselves down, then, and I'll fetch you some proper food. You both look half-starved." As they settled at a wooden table near the window, Clara became aware of the other patrons in the establishment. Two men sat at the bar nursing whiskey and speaking in low voices, while an elderly woman occupied a corner table with what appeared to be a substantial pile of mending. All of them had glanced up when she and Luke entered, but their attention seemed casual rather than suspicious. Bridget Murphy returned with bowls of thick beef stew and plates of fresh bread that was still warm from the oven. The food was simple but expertly prepared, and Clara found herself eating with an appetite she hadn't realized she possessed. "You folks wouldn't happen to be running from something, would you?" Patrick Murphy asked quietly, settling into a chair across from them. His tone was conversational, but Clara detected an undercurrent of serious concern. Luke's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, but Murphy raised a peaceful palm. "Easy there, son. I'm not looking to cause trouble. It's just that we've had some visitors recently, asking questions about strangers passing through. The kind of visitors that make decent folks nervous." "What kind of visitors?" Clara asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "Man calling himself Deputy Marshal Kane, along with some companions who didn't look much like lawmen to me. They were asking about a kidnapped woman and the outlaw who took her." Murphy's eyes met Clara's directly, offered a substantial reward for information, and made it clear they weren't particular about how they collected their fugitives. Clara felt the familiar chill of fear, but also something else, a growing anger at the persistent lies being spread about her situation. "And what did you tell them?" "Same thing I tell all busybodies who come around asking questions that aren't their business, that I mind my own affairs and expect others to do the same." Murphy leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "But I will say this. Any woman traveling with a kidnapper wouldn't be sitting here eating my wife's stew like she was raised to proper table manners. And any outlaw worth the name wouldn't be polite enough to call me sir when asking for supplies." Bridget Murphy had been listening to this exchange while refilling their coffee cups, and now she spoke up with the authority of a woman accustomed to plain speaking. "Patrick, stop dancing around the subject and ask them straight out." Her husband chuckled. "Very well. Are you Clara Whitfield, the banker's daughter from Cedar Ridge? And if so, are you here by your own choice or someone else's?" The direct question hung in the air like smoke from a rifle shot. Clara looked at Luke, seeing her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. They had been living on the run for days now, trusting no one completely, carrying the constant fear of betrayal. But something about the Murphys suggested honesty, and Clara was tired of living in the shadows of other people's lies. "I am Clara Whitfield," she said quietly, "and I'm here because I chose to be here. No one kidnapped me, and no one forced me to leave my father's house. I left because I refused to marry a man I don't love to satisfy my father's business arrangements." Patrick Murphy nodded as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "That's what I figured. Takes a certain kind of courage for a woman to walk away from security in favor of uncertainty. Not many would have the backbone for it. The question is," Bridget added practically, "what do you plan to do now? Those men who were here asking questions, they had the look of folks who don't give up easy. And winter's coming on fast in the high country." Luke spoke for the first time since Murphy had asked his direct question. "We're trying to reach Haven Creek in Colorado Territory. I've got a friend there who might help us get started somewhere new." "Haven Creek," Murphy mused. "That's hard country to reach even in good weather. This time of year—" He shook his head doubtfully. "Devil's Backbone Pass is the only way through, and it's treacherous when the snows start. More treacherous than staying here with Cain hunting us? Clara asked. Different kind of treacherous, Bridget replied. Mountains will kill you quick and clean if you make a mistake. Men like Cain, they take their time about it. The elderly woman in the corner looked up from her mending, her voice carrying clearly across the room. Excuse me for listening in, but I couldn't help overhearing. She set down her needlework and approached their table with the careful steps of someone whose joints had begun to protest the passage of years. I'm Agnes Caldwell, and I've been living in these mountains for nigh on 40 years. If you're set on crossing Devil's Backbone, there's something you need to know. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What's that, ma'am? There's another way through. An old Indian trail that most folks don't know about. It's longer and harder than the main pass, but it's also less likely to be watched by men with badges and guns. Agnes's eyes were sharp despite her advanced years. My late husband used to trade with the Cherokee before they were driven out. He showed me that trail once, said it was a sacred path used for centuries by people who needed to disappear. Would you, Luke began, then stopped, clearly struggling with the magnitude of what he was asking. Would I what? Draw you a map to save your lives? Agnes smiled, the expression transforming her weathered features. Child, I've been watching young people fight for the right to choose their own destinies since before you were born. Of course I'll help you. As Agnes settled at their table and began sketching directions on a piece of brown paper, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. For days, she had been running from the life others had planned for her, driven by desperation and fear. But sitting here in this rough mountain settlement, surrounded by people who offered help to strangers simply because it was the right thing to do, she began to understand that she wasn't just running from something. She was running toward a future of her own making. There's one more thing, Agnes said as she finished her crude map. You'll need warmer clothes for the high country, and food that won't spoil in the cold. This trail will take you through country where there's no shelter and no forgiveness for mistakes. Bridget Murphy was already moving toward the back of the store. I've got woolen coats that should fit, and we can put together food supplies that will see you through. We can pay, Clara said, thinking of the small cache of money she carried. Course you can, Patrick Murphy replied easily. Fair trade for fair goods, but we're not looking to profit from folks in your situation. Just want to see you get where you're going safely. As they gathered supplies and prepared for the final, most dangerous leg of their journey, Clara found herself thinking about the choices that had brought her to this moment. A week ago, she had been a dutiful daughter preparing for a marriage that would secure her future according to other people's plans. Now she was an outlaw, planning to cross some of the most dangerous terrain in the territories with a man she loved but barely knew, carrying nothing but hope and the courage to claim her own destiny. The transformation should have terrified her. Instead, she felt more alive than she ever had in her father's house. Outside, storm clouds were gathering around the peaks, and the wind carried the sharp promise of snow. Winter was coming to the mountains, and with it the final test of whether love and freedom were worth the price they were demanding. Clara pulled the borrowed woolen coat tighter around her shoulders and smiled. Whatever lay ahead on the Devil's Backbone, she would face it as herself, not as Samuel Whitfield's obedient daughter or Henry Blackwood's unwilling bride, but as Clara, a woman who had chosen her own path and was prepared to walk it to the end. The ancient Cherokee Trail led through country that seemed to exist outside the ordinary world. For 3 days, Clara and Luke had followed Agnes Caldwell's hand-drawn map through passages that were little more than deer paths, across streams that had no names. and over ridges that offered views of wilderness stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The higher they climbed, the more the civilized world fell away behind them. Here, in this realm of granite peaks and bottomless sky, the petty concerns of drawing rooms and business arrangements seemed as distant as the stars. Clara found herself changing with each mile gained, shedding the last vestiges of the proper young lady she had been trained to be. On the morning of the fourth day, they crested a final ridge and saw their destination spread below them like a promised land. The valley of Haven Creek nestled between protective mountains, its meadows still green despite the approaching winter, its stream catching the early sunlight like scattered silver coins. "There it is," Luke said softly, his voice carrying 7 years of hope and planning. "Our new beginning." Clara studied the small settlement that dotted the valley floor, perhaps 24 buildings scattered along the creek, with gardens and corrals that spoke of people making permanent homes in this remote place. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see tiny figures moving about their morning routines, living lives far from the judgment and control of the outside world. But even as her heart lifted at the sight of sanctuary, Clara knew their journey was far from over. They had outrun Cain and his men, survived the treacherous mountain crossing, and found the hidden valley Luke had dreamed of reaching. Yet the hardest challenge still lay ahead, the challenge of building a life worthy of all they had sacrificed to claim it. As they rode down into the valley, Clara became aware of curious eyes watching their approach. Haven Creek was the kind of place where strangers were noticed, where people survived by knowing who belonged and who might bring trouble. She straightened in her saddle, determined to meet these potential neighbors with dignity rather than the desperate gratitude of a refugee. The first person to approach them was a woman of middle years with iron-gray hair and hands that spoke of hard work honestly done. She emerged from what appeared to be a general store, wiping her palms on a practical apron as she studied the newcomers. "Morning," she called out, her tone friendly but cautious. "I'm Sarah McNeil. You folks look like you've traveled a fair piece to get here." "Yes, ma'am," Luke replied, dismounting and helping Clara down from her horse. "I'm Luke Dawson, and this is Miss Clara Whitfield. We're looking for a man named Benjamin Torres. I believe he operates a trading post here." Sarah's expression shifted to one of recognition mixed with surprise. "Ben Torres? Well, He's been expecting someone named Dawson for near on 2 months now. Said an old friend might be coming through, though he didn't mention bringing a lady." Her sharp eyes took in Clara's travel-worn appearance, noting the quality beneath the wear. "You're welcome to Haven Creek, both of you. Ben's place is just down the creek a ways. The big log building with the green door." As they led their horses through the settlement, Clara felt the weight of curious gazes but sensed no hostility in them. These were people who understood the value of privacy, who had likely come to this remote valley for reasons of their own. Children paused in their play to watch the strangers pass, while adults offered polite nods without demanding explanations. They found Benjamin Torres exactly where Sarah McNeil had indicated, a weathered man with kind eyes and graying hair, standing in the doorway of a substantial log building that served as both store and living quarters. His face lit up with genuine pleasure when he saw Luke approaching. "Luke Dawson, you son of a gun!" Ben strode forward with arms outstretched, embracing his old friend with the enthusiasm of someone who had thought he might never see him again. "I was starting to wonder if you'd changed your mind about that offer I made. Just took me a while to work up the courage to accept it," Luke replied, returning the embrace with equal warmth. "Ben, I'd like you to meet Clara Whitfield. Clara, this is Benjamin Torres, The man who saved my life in Colorado and has been trying to convince me to become a respectable citizen ever since. Ben turned his attention to Clara, his weathered features creasing into a smile of genuine welcome. Miss Whitfield, it's a pleasure. Though I have to say, Luke's letters didn't mention he was bringing such distinguished company to our little valley. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, suddenly aware of how she must appear after days on the trail. Her riding dress was stained and torn, her hair escaping its pins, and her hands bore the calluses and scratches of someone unaccustomed to outdoor living. Yet Ben Torres looked at her with the same respect he might show a lady in a drawing room. "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Torres," she replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Luke has told me so much about your kindness to him." "Kindness nothing," Ben scoffed good-naturedly. "Man pulls you out of a snowdrift and patches up your bullet wounds. You owe him more than kindness. You owe him friendship for life." He gestured toward his building with obvious pride. "Come inside, both of you. We've got coffee on the stove and a lot of catching up to do." The interior of Ben's trading post was warm and welcoming, with shelves lined with everything from tools and ammunition to bolts of fabric and jars of preserves. A comfortable living area occupied one end of the large room, complete with a stone fireplace that radiated warmth against the mountain chill. As they settled around a rough wooden table with steaming cups of coffee, Ben studied them both with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to reading people's stories in their faces. "So," he said finally, "what brings Luke Dawson and a banker's daughter to Haven Creek in the middle of October? And don't tell me it's just a social visit, because you both have the look of folks who've been running hard from something." Clara and Luke exchanged glances, and she saw her own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. How much should they reveal? How much did Ben need to know about the circumstances that had brought them here? Luke made the decision for both of them. "We're in love, Ben." And some powerful people back in the territories didn't approve of Clara's choice to be with me instead of the man they picked out for her. Ben's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained carefully neutral. "I see. And these powerful people, they the type to let sleeping dogs lie? Or are they likely to come looking for you?" "They've already been looking," Clara said quietly. "We've been running for over a week, staying ahead of a bounty hunter and my former fiancé who seemed determined to drag me back whether I want to go or not." "Former fiancé," Ben repeated thoughtfully. "Let me guess, arranged marriage? Family business considerations?" "Something like that," Clara replied, surprised by how easily this stranger understood the complexities of her situation. Ben nodded as if such stories were common in his experience. "Well, you've come to the right place then. Haven Creek has a way of becoming home to folks who need a fresh start away from other people's expectations." He leaned back in his chair, studying them both. "Question is, what do you plan to do now that you're here? This valley's got room for people willing to work hard and build something lasting. But it's not a place for tourists or folks just passing through." Luke straightened, his voice carrying the weight of long-considered decisions. "I want to take you up on that offer you made last spring. The partnership in your trading operation. Maybe some land where Clara and I can build a home." "And what does the lady want?" Ben asked, turning his attention directly to Clara. "Because no offense to Luke here, but this valley's hard on women who aren't prepared for frontier living. We're a long way from shops and social calls and the kind of life a banker's daughter might be accustomed to." Clara felt a familiar spark of defiance at the assumption, but recognized that Ben's question came from concern rather than condescension. "Mr. Torres," she said carefully, "for the past week I've been cooking over open fires, sleeping on the ground, and riding through country that would challenge an experienced mountain man. I've learned to build fires that don't smoke, to read weather signs, and to find my way by the stars. I may have been raised as a banker's daughter, but I'm stronger than I look. Ben's smile was slow but genuine. I imagine you are, Miss Whitfield. Question is, are you ready to stay strong for the long haul? Because building a life in a place like this isn't just about surviving. It's about choosing to belong somewhere and making that choice work every day for the rest of your life. The weight of that question settled over Clara like a heavy cloak. For weeks, she had been focused on escape, on running from a life she didn't want. But Ben was asking her to consider what she was running toward, what kind of future she wanted to build with the freedom she had claimed. She thought of the ivory wedding dress hanging empty in her father's house, of the social obligations and careful proprieties that had defined her existence for 25 years. Then she looked around Ben's simple, honest trading post, imagined the life she might build here with Luke. Harder than what she had known, certainly, but infinitely more real. I'm ready, she said firmly. I choose this place, this life, this future, whatever it takes to build something worth having. I'm ready to do it. Ben studied her for a long moment, then nodded with satisfaction. Then welcome to Haven Creek, Clara Whitfield. I have a feeling you're going to fit in just fine. As the afternoon wore on, Ben showed them around the settlement, introducing them to neighbors who welcomed them with the easy acceptance of people who understood that everyone deserved a second chance. Clara met Sarah McNeil, who ran the general store with quiet efficiency, Dr. James Morrison, a former army surgeon who had come west to escape his own ghosts, and Margaret Chen, a widow who taught the settlement's children and maintained a garden that was the envy of the entire valley. Each person they met had their own story of transformation, their own reasons for choosing this remote place over the conventional world. Yet none of them asked intrusive questions or demanded explanations. In Haven Creek, it seemed a person's past mattered less than their willingness to contribute to the community's future. As evening approached, Ben led them to a small cabin on the outskirts of the settlement, empty but well-maintained, with windows that looked out over the creek and mountains beyond. This place has been waiting for the right tenants, he said, handing Luke a key made of rough iron. It's yours if you want it, at least until you decide where to build your own home. Clara stepped inside and felt something settle in her chest, a sense of rightness she had never experienced in all her years in her father's grand house. The cabin was simple but solid, with a stone fireplace, wooden floors worn smooth by previous occupants, and an atmosphere of peace that seemed to seep from the very walls. It's perfect, she whispered, and meant it. That night, as they sat before their own fireplace drinking coffee and planning their future. Clara felt the last chains of her old life finally fall away. She was no longer Samuel Whitfield's dutiful daughter or Henry Blackwood's reluctant bride. She was simply Clara, a woman who had chosen love over security, freedom over convention, and the uncertain promise of tomorrow over the suffocating certainty of yesterday. Outside their window, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the creek sang its eternal song of water finding its way home. In the morning, there would be work to do, a life to build, and a future to create from nothing but hope and determination. But tonight, Clara Whitfield was exactly where she belonged, in a place of her own choosing, with the man she loved, carrying nothing but the courage to write her own story and the faith that it would be worth telling.